So we've lost Frank. What a year. Lost Carlos, lost Frank. My thoughts are that I think, he's played a great innings. I mean, it's a cliche to say that, but why not say that? It's in sort of, Englishese. It's the way Frank would see it, I think, even though he never really liked cricket. But I think also, wow, 1986, he had that neck injury between the fourth and fifth vertebra. Had his all movement basically except his biceps, triceps went, and everything below that. So he had to learn, obviously, even to breathe differently. Any mortal human being, I think, wouldn't have lasted anything like as long. But Frank did. And it was interesting after that accident, after the road accident, because he was throughout his life incredibly disciplined, incredible self-control and incredible motivation. But in terms of running half marathons, his diet, his travel schedules, everything, whatever it was, he'd be flying across America and he would have a 1.5 hour layover in Chicago, and he'd take his running kit in a bag, go for a run around the airport in 25 minutes, get back on the plane. That was Frank. And when the accident happened, I guess we all thought it would be a similar thing. He would apply this incredibly rigid regime to physio and recovery. But we saw the other side of Frank then. We saw Frank, the racer, and the racer said inside him, I think, just get to the next race. That's what it's all about. That's what your life has always been about, Frank, the next race. And that's what matters most. And so he kind of pushed the physio to one side, I think to the horror of quite a lot of doctors, certainly to the astonishment of quite a lot of doctors. And but it worked. He was back in circulation relatively quickly. I think it was Brands Hatch, 86, that he made his first appearance. And then thereafter, he was going to virtually all the races. Obviously not towards the end, different thing towards the end. But for a long time, he was hands-on, in control again. I mean, one of the best things that ever happened to Frank was the present Nelson Piquet gave him after the accident, which was a huge touchpad telephone, which enabled Frank to get back control of his life again. Anyway, I'm kind of ahead of it there, I guess, because now I just think about Frank's life and everything he did in racing. When I was growing up, he was one of my heroes. There was no doubt about that. I mean, the Frank Williams racing team with that arrow, and it was a bit of an arrow, dark blue, yellow or white. Depended on the mood, I think, what paint was around in the race shop in Reading, what stripes he had on the car. But, that dark blue F2 Brabham and F1 Brabham, Piers Courage, Frank Williams, it was the business. Formula One didn't get much better, I think, in terms of the look and the feel of what that was all about, that combo. And of course, Frank then lost Piers, to whom he was very close. He was close to Sheridan, Charlie Lucas, Jonathan Williams, Charlie Crichton Stewart. There was the sort of Eton gang, if you like, and he was very close to Piers. And yet, Piers had that accident at Zandvoort in 70. In a Dallara, interestingly, Frank, way ahead of his time in that respect, brought Dallara into Formula One, you could say. Plenty of other things he brought into Formula One as well. But he recovered like a racer. Racers do. Recovered. He went forward as a racers do. Brian Redmond, Tim Schenken, other drivers quickly in the car. And then a relatively lean period. When I first came over to Formula One, it was 72, and Frank was running a two-car team, Polly Toys and Carlos Pache, Henri Pescarola. Henri was very quick, but unbelievable number of shunts, successive shunts in a row. It would be, I was going down the hill and suddenly I could not see and the car is destroyed. And this would have happened every race. And Frank, charging on, next race, get it done, get it fixed. Actually, on that note, I had a lot of fun with Frank recently, actually, remembering Jonathan Williams' columns in Autosport I think I've mentioned this on a video, during the time of the Formula 2 Temporada, and how Frank, between races, which were consecutive weekends, double headers, flew back to England to March with a cabin bag full of bits and bobs, including, I think, a chassis and got them all repaired, and was back in Colombia. I think it was Colombia. It might have been Argentina for the next race. But that was Frank, just all over the world, traveling, stuff everywhere, incredibly organised, but at the same time chaotic in the sense of he never, for a long time, had enough money to do everything correctly. So 72 was, that was an interesting year of Frank's survival. 73, it got worse. The John Clark chassis was not great, and it was a hard time. A lot of renter drivers in that Williams. Arturo Mazzario kept Frank going for a long time, actually. A lot of credit to Art. Quick driver too, really good guy. Didn't speak any English at all. Doesn't speak any English, still with us. But he was always there with his Marlboro Italia money and a few other bits and bobs. And then, I was kind of friends with him. That's when we started running around tracks together a lot on Friday and Saturday nights, and became buddies with Frank then, really. And I was always impressed by his loyalty to drivers, particularly his respect, in general respect for everyone in racing. He was incredibly polite and respectful, which was a really nice trait. And then, of course, it kind of ended in tears when he had to sell out to Walter Wolf, and he did that very uncomfortable year in 76. But from that came the friendship with Patrick Head, came the new Williams, which was rebooted in 77. I remember distinctly, I think it was on the steps of the Hilton in Sao Paulo in 77, early 77, and Frank was just saying, I've had enough. Walter's got me doing all sorts of things, driving all over the country, picking him up here, dropping off some cargo there, meeting one of his mates there. I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm Frank Williams. I'm going to do a race team again. And and those days you could do it. He bought a March with money he got from Patrick Nave, a very good Belgian driver. And you only had to run one car, and he only did the European rounds in 77. If only it was so easy today. And he did that, and he did pretty well, and the car looked nice, and Patrick Head was doing a few mods to the March while he was designing a new Williams. I remember Frank saying, I'm going to call the company Williams Grand Prix Engineering, because it's all about engineering. That's what Formula One is, engineering. And he was right, of course, way ahead of his time there as well. Nobody else called their race teams engineering teams in those days. And then early in 78, he gave me a ring and invited me to lunch at the Steering Wheel Club, which sadly no longer exists, in Curzon Street, very near Sterling Moss's house, and said that he was going to do a completely new path of sponsorship procurement and tap the Middle East, and he was going to show the East how they could be the best in the West, and he was going to focus on Saudi Arabia. And he did, and he pulled Saudi Arabian Airlines, and he got some other sponsors. And these stories you hear about Frank wearing out a pair of shoes and knocking on doors, believe me, they're true. In those days, he would go to Riyadh and he would just sit and wait until he could get an audience with somebody with money, usually a member of the royal family. And it was that persistence that paid off. And also his ability, incredible ability to pick up languages very, very quickly, which he did. Time and again, Japanese, Arabic, obviously fluent in Italian and French, pretty good in German. I mean, it was just a complete gift that he had, and he used it well in terms of sponsorship and motorsport. That was his direction for that. So 78, it's looking back now, that was a very, very good car that Patrick designed. It was the last of the last pre-ground effect car, because that was a year, of course, that Lotus effectively changed Formula One with ground effect and brought skirts in, the Lotus 79. But in that non-ground effect Williams FW06, Alan Jones was really, really good on occasions, right to the end. I mean, even at Watkins Glen, he was really quick. And then they progressed to Clay. I mean, Clay and Frank, I've always felt was a great marriage, great friendship, and a lot of mutual respect. And in a way, it was kind of nice that Clay scored Frank's first Grand Prix win at Silverstone 79. In another way, it was irritating because Alan Jones was always quicker and, as we know, went on to win the World Championship in 1980. But, there was that side of Frank, which was, he loved Italy, he loved exotic cool people. And Clay was one of those, let's face it. Nelson was, Carlos was, some other drivers weren't, who shall remain nameless, but Frank was always attracted to those. And during that period I was working really closely with Frank on all the sponsorship he was doing, helping him with sponsors, and it was brilliant. And then he asked me to join the team full time, which I did in '85. I remember the first thing he said when he called me into his office was, "Peter, two things. We never ever poach sponsors from other teams. Never. Don't even think about it. Only bring in new companies to the sport, or obviously keep the companies that we're racing with. And the same goes for personnel." And I thought, yeah, wow, that's different. And he worked by that creed, and it was wonderful. So '85 for me was an amazing year. That was because I'd also been lucky enough to work closely with Nigel Mansell from Formula 3, and Nigel was in the team. It took quite a bit of persuasion for Frank to sign Nigel, I've got to say, because he was under a lot of pressure. He was indecisive, certainly. I mean, they say Jim Clark was indecisive. I bet he was completely decisive compared with Frank Williams. Frank just could not make up his mind about anything. And if there was a difficult decision to make, his solution was always to go down the middle or do nothing and let the passage of time make the decision for him. And it was like that with drivers, really. It was certainly like that with Nigel, because there was a lot of the popular press, if you like, the media, the British media wanted, I think, Derek Warwick big time, and I think Patrick did as well. And Nigel was kind of, if you're really struggling, you might as well take Nigel Mansell. And I had to go down and force Frank's arm, really, to get him to sign Nigel. But I think he very quickly understood that Nigel was a different sort of guy. And although he didn't have this exotic feel that, say, a Nelson Piquet would, he had something else, which was this sort of raw determination and feel for just getting the results and being a racer. And I think Frank bonded with that very quickly. In the middle of that, there was also the Ayrton Senna situation. And this came under the heading of what I was just saying about personnel and respecting other drivers. He like everybody, he could see the potential in Ayrton and how good Ayrton was, and he loved Ayrton from day one. I think the whole Ayrton thing was right up Frank's street, and he gave Ayrton his first ever Formula One test in '83 in a Williams Cosworth at Donington, and Ayrton of course went really well. But you would imagine, well, I always imagined at the time, that if you're going to take the trouble to put a Formula 3 driver in your car purely because you think he's pretty good, give him a run, and he is pretty good, and he does a good job in the test, you would imagine that you would kind of cover your situation and sign him, and at least get him signed on as a test driver, whatever, and keep him under wraps for a few years and race him. But Frank didn't do any of that. He just wanted to give Ayrton a try, gave him a try, but because he was already contracted to Keke Rosberg and Jacques Lafitte, it didn't enter his head to break either of those two contracts. And that was classic Frank. He could have had Ayrton back then, but he just wouldn't do it. And yeah, that says a lot, I think, about Frank's ethics and his moral code and the way he went about his racing. Yeah, of course, he loved Bernie, and he loved the way Bernie operated and the deals Bernie did. It was more awe and wonder, I think, with Bernie, from Frank to Bernie, because it was Bernie could just do things that Frank could never dream were possible. And he loved everything about Bernie. He loved his sense of humor. He loved the way he did his deals, and the short, sharp phone calls were right up Frank's street as well. You'd never sit on the phone rambling on with Frank. But at the same time, I think because of that, he kind of turned a blind eye periodically to some of the things Bernie was doing, which weren't necessarily in the interest of Williams, and used to annoy Patrick a bit, I think. And certainly looking back now in terms of the business of Formula One, perhaps things could have been a little bit better had Bernie not been given the carte blanche that he was. But at the same time, Bernie knew what he was doing with Frank, and he got the deal. So that was what was on the table. So it went from there. The road accident, '86, obviously changed Frank's life dramatically in terms of his mobility, obviously, and what he could do. He was concerned mainly about the impact it would have on Honda, and on the sponsors and whether the team would keep going. And when we were, when the car had come to rest and I'd got Frank out the back of the car, the first thing he said to me was, Peter, if this doesn't work out, I think the phrase he used, if I don't make it, I think he said, I want you to tell Patrick that all the sponsors for this year are signed, the sponsors for next year are 2/3 signed, and I'd like a priest, is what he said, because I'm a Catholic and I'd like the last rites. And luckily, you know, they were days absolutely on the edge. And it was basically, it was me and Ginny in France, because a lot of the people came out, Sid Watkins and the team and Sheridan and Patrick came out, but within a couple of days they went back to England again, believing that Frank was in good hands in that huge French hospital in Marseille. But he wasn't really, and we had to get him out of the intensive care unit 4 days later to get him back to England. But in that whole period, the thing was, you know, let's just hope he lives. That's better than anything else. Doesn't matter if he's in a wheelchair, let's just let him live. And I think, you know, when people say, oh, you know, what a shame he's in that wheelchair and poor Frank, you know, you've got to see it in the perspective and the context of what could have happened and what he's gone on, what he went on to do from the wheelchair and how he's able to run his life around that, as a racer would. And, you know, it just went on from there. And Frank, you know, bless him. I mean, I remember I was sitting in the, I think I've told this story before, but this is for people who don't know this, and it does sum up Frank as well. When he was kind of back at work, back at Didcot, going to the factory every day with a driver, you know, putting him in the car and taking him to the factory. Paris Match magazine wanted to do an interview with him and sent a French journalist over who sat in the back seat next to Frank, and I was sitting in the passenger seat next to the driver. And I remember the French journalist saying to Frank, but Monsieur Williams, has this accident changed the way you think about life? Because you have always been in Formula One, do you have a different perspective on life? And Frank said, well, yes, I think there were 3 or 4 days after the accident when I thought, you know, perhaps I should have taken a few holidays and maybe had a few Sunday lunches at home, but I'm back to normal now. You know, if nothing else, as an employee of Williams, I felt, I better cancel that holiday. Yeah, holidays. Well, Frank was never going to take a holiday. He never did. Everything was racing. Everything was the next phone call, the next deal. And that took him right through the rest of the 80s with the turbo Honda engine and those amazing races with Nigel and Nelson. I mean, that was classic Frank as well, completely chaotic, because he'd signed Nelson as number one, but because Nelson always thought he was going to blow Nigel away, he never thought of putting in a clause to say, oh, by the way, if I am number one and the other guy's ahead of me, I've got the right to overtake him. Nelson never put that in, so that wasn't in there. And then simultaneously, Frank did a deal with Honda for the drivers to wear Honda caps on the podium. When, of course, we all know they had to wear the cap of the tyre company, Goodyear. So every race we had the Honda guy down below the podium throwing up the Honda caps like this, and I was trying to sort of hold him at bay and distract him and do other things. And simultaneously there was Nelson moaning about, you know, Nigel being allowed to win because he was an English driver and he had a better engine or better chassis, whatever he had. So it was a complete mess. But it was classic Frank, and he loved it. And he never wanted to solve the problems because it meant making a big decision, which he didn't want to do that. I think ultimately he just didn't want to hurt people. He just wanted to keep things going. Again, a lovely character trait, a charm, really, one of the charming sides of Frank. The other thing about Frank with drivers, and it was Ginny that pointed this out to me, was that Frank would rather outbid, say, Ron Dennis or Ferrari and pay a massive amount of money for a superstar and show that he could afford it and get that superstar than sign that superstar when he was still unknown on a 10-year contract and take advantage of having this guy's talent for nothing. He'd much prefer option one. I found that out for myself, kind of with Nigel, because I've been on and on and on about how good Nigel was. And yeah, he got Nigel in before he'd won races, but I mean, he had led races by the time he went to Williams. But I remember taking Mark Webber to Williams just after he'd won the Formula Ford Festival, saying, look, Frank, you know, Nigel is there. You know, he's out there in history now as a great driver. Here's another guy that for sure is going to win Grand Prix, maybe a World Championship. He's really, really good. He's just won the Formula Ford Festival. He's from Australia. He's from Queen Bee, and he's Mark Webber. We should sign him now, get him on a contract, get him on the whole Williams path. And Frank just wouldn't do it. He said, well, if he's that good, why has nobody else signed him? So I gave up at that point. Of course, he then did sign Mark, presumably had to pay him quite a lot of money, as indeed he did with Ralf Schumacher, who he was never convinced that Ralf was that good. So when he signed Ralf, he built in lots of get-out clauses in case he turned out to be as bad as he thought he was going to be. And of course, when Ralf did turn out to be pretty good, and BMW said, we want Ralf, Ralf just then took Frank to the cleaners and said, well, you know, I'm going to go and drive for somebody else. And in the end, Frank had to pay a fortune to keep him. You know, lots of things like that. But, you know, I'm not going to sit here and be negative about it, because I see it all now as Frank's, as I say, his charm and the way he went about his racing. And you could argue, you know, in the last great days of Williams, when they were winning races with BMW, Juan Pablo Montoya and Ralf, BMW wanted to buy Williams, certainly a majority stake. You know, Frank wouldn't do it. He just wanted to own that company and make the decisions himself. And I don't think anything gave him more pleasure than doing deals with drivers and signing this guy and not signing that guy and taking this call there and not taking that call there and burning in the middle. And, you know, that's what he was all about. He just loved it all. He loved it all. He loved life and he loved racing. And, you know, that's how he was able to put up, I think, with the wheelchair, because he never really felt sorry for himself. He just wanted to get on with his racing and a few other things. You know, he loved classical music, Edward Elgar, and you know, he loved history. And because, I mean, he had this photographic memory for detail, for obscure detail, registration of aircraft, how many aircraft in a specific fleet of for any given airline, routes, aircraft routes, and all sorts of other weird things. And yet other stuff, like in the days when we all had video recorders, he found it very difficult to program a video recorder. You know, that was just Frank, and there are things that I'm completely useless at, things that I'm slightly better at. And that was, I'm just giving you an idea of what Frank was like in that regard. But I suppose, you know, there are many, many more things to say, and they will be said, and maybe I'll say some of them in the future as well. But I'd just like to finish this by saying, I've been saying sort of tongue-in-cheek for the last 4 months, with the build-up to this Saudi Arabian Grand Prix this weekend, that I hope that Liberty are going to be doing a massive tribute to Frank, because it was Frank that originally brought Saudi Arabia into Formula One, with the Saudi Arabian Airlines Williams FW06 in 1978, as we all know. And I was saying, and I really hope that Frank is recognised before this Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. And I was saying that knowing, of course, that he wasn't going to be recognised at all. But now he's passed away, guess what? He will be recognised. And I think, you know, if there's a Saudi Dreamliner or 747 or whatever it is flying over the grid before the start of the Grand Prix this weekend, believe me, Frank's spirit will be there, and he'll probably know the registration of the aircraft, its history, and he'll probably know the freight tonnage at any given moment of that aircraft on any given route that it's doing around the world. That was Frank Williams.